Yeah, this afternoon, and I think today's debate is an incredibly important one. It does raise important issues about sovereignty, but I think it also delves into issues which are far broader than that, which we've touched on already. And I'm under no illusions as to why this petition has received such a large number of signatures. It is because of what has been suggested could be in this treaty. But whilst researching for this debate, I did find a broad range of concerns, some of which I think are entirely reasonable, others of which are completely absurd. On the absurd side, there is a narrative that's been created that the World Health Organization is a body intent on world domination, borrowing tropes from conspiracy theories. I found one website referring to the WHO as globalists who drain our resources, serve our enemies and continue working to establish a global dictatorship over everyone and everything. I believe that sentiment is clearly ludicrous, as is the reference to the WHO being owned by Bill Gates or indeed the Chinese government. The reality, however, is far more mundane than a narrative spun. The first key point to remember, of course, is that nothing has yet been agreed. The treaty is being negotiated by, as we speak, amongst others, representatives of the United Kingdom. It really cannot be viewed as having something being imposed upon us when we are actually helping to develop. Indeed, it's also important to note that it was actually our Prime Minister at the time who was one of the signatories of the statement of intent to actually instigate these discussions. Certainly will.
It's on the record, as a former international health minister who has been responsible for the WHO within government and working with them, they are a supranational organisation, but they 100% are driven by their members. And we, as the second largest donor, and one of its founding members, are one of the most respected members around that table. So we are designing this process. We should be proud of that and at the heart of that, and then submit it to scrutiny by us doing our job. Does he not agree?
Yeah, I'm grateful to the chair of the Select Committee, who has got a great deal of experience in this area about why, actually, as a country, we are leaders in this field, and why we should be proud of our role in creating WHO and fighting these pandemics that have happened over recent years. And I think it's also the case that, like all treaties, there is an opportunity for parliamentary intervention that's set out in the law, that's already established, and the government have committed, I think, in their response, that any subsequent domestic regulations would need to be passed before this treaty is actually ratified. And of course, as we've already heard, we can, if we decide, opt out of it. So there is no question that this is something that is going to be done to us. We have the opportunity as a sovereign nation to say no to this. And I think, actually, given the amount of time that this House has spent debating questions of national sovereignty over the last 5 or 6 years, I think it would be counter to recent experience for us to be doing something that would actually give away sovereignty. And actually, there are important principles about parliamentary accountability that we need to bear in mind, because it would be, I think, unfair to actually allow some of the wild conspiracy theories to overshadow what I think are legitimate concerns about any potential impingement on our sovereignty and our democracy. And I think in terms of the specifics of the treaty, as I said already, the key to note is that actually it hasn't been finalised yet. But what we do know is there are broad parameters of negotiation set out in the latest zero draft of this, published in February. From what we can see from that, it says the guiding mission is, and I quote, to prevent pandemics, save lives, reduce disease burden and protect livelihoods through strengthening proactively the world's capacities for preventing, preparing for and responding to and recovery of health systems from pandemics. Now, I would be very surprised if anyone objected to that as a set of guiding principles, but it is reasonable to ask what this definition means in practice. What is the procedure for declaring a pandemic, and what safeguards will be in place to ensure that individual liberties and rights are protected? And it is those questions and that ambiguity that has been seized upon by those who want to undermine global cooperation by stating fears that the treaty will restrict people's freedom of speech to the extent that dissenters could actually be imprisoned. It would impose instruments that impede on our daily life and also institute widespread global surveillance without warning and without the consent of world leaders. In other words, some of the hallmarks that we see from totalitarian governments, combined with supercharged lockdown measures, of course, which are all already within the power of this government under the Public Health Act 1984. And indeed, these things under this treaty would apparently be done without our government having a say. If those claims had any basis in fact, then I think we would all be right to be concerned. But those claims are simply ones that do not stand up to scrutiny. Fact checkers have consistently stated that the WHO would have no capacity to force members to comply with public health measures. Indeed, a WHO spokesman is quoted as saying, "As with all international instruments, any accord, even when agreed, will be determined by governments themselves who would take any action while considering their own national laws and regulations." So the very idea that we would allow our citizens to be imprisoned by a third party for expressing an opinion on something in this country is absurd. It is just not going to happen. We live in a liberal democracy, and I know that members across this House are determined to keep it that way. It is those nations that want to undermine Western democratic values, who want to create disarray, who are pushing this narrative that there is an unaccountable, unelected global group of people who are seeking to take control of our lives. So we can both protect our values of freedom and democracy and work more closely with other countries in the face of a global threat. Those two aims can be entirely consistent with one another. Creating a global treaty is an entirely reasonable and responsible course of action. One of the most important messages to emerge from COVID-19 was that we need to be better prepared for the next one. We have learned that global cooperation is crucial to success, whether that is coordinating measures to suppress transmission or conducting vaccine rollouts. It took the world far too long to understand that under the conditions of a pandemic, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. So to my mind, the question is much more about whether this Parliament and this government is up to the task of dealing with another public health emergency in a way that ensures democratic accountability and public confidence is maintained. As someone who spent many hours dealing with public health regulations during the COVID pandemic, I would say there is much to be done in terms of improving how Parliament has a role in that. And we know at times decisions had to be taken quickly, but far too often COVID regulations were debated weeks or even months after they were introduced. And as the pandemic progressed, it felt that there was no effort being made to have regulations debated before they came into force. And on numerous occasions, there was no objective reason as to why that needed to be the case. Indeed, sometimes the rules were only made publicly available on the government website minutes before they became law. So trying to obtain clarity about which measures, individually or collectively, were considered likely to lead to an increase or decrease in transmission rates was mission impossible. When we were able to see the minutes of SAGE meetings, which in the very early stages of the pandemic we were not, there was often very little correlation between them and the measures being debated. Sometimes there was no statement or explanatory memorandum that the measures being put forward in the regulations had even been considered by the scientific advisor. Often there was no SAGE minutes either that stated that these matters had been considered. Often what SAGE were recommending did not even make it into the regulations themselves. I'm sure many of us can remember the contradictions and confusions about some of the measures that were introduced. Why was an area in a particular tier, and the lack of clarity about how you moved in a tier and out of a tier, the decision to close pubs. I will.
I'm glad he agrees that we needed better parliamentary scrutiny and more options for the handling of the pandemic. But given that that is the case, how on earth does it make sense to give away powers to an international quango who would then instruct future ministers to do these things, and Parliament would be told it had no right to talk about it or to vote on it?
Well, if that's how it was going to proceed, then I would agree with him, but I don't believe that is the case. And I think anyone on that side who's concerned about parliamentary sovereignty and scrutiny would not have voted for the EU revocation bill, which just puts thousands of laws into the hands of ministers without any parliamentary accountability. But returning to the question of how the last pandemic was dealt with, there were other examples of where decisions were made without seemingly any evidence to back them up. The decision to close pubs at 10 o'clock is a good example. The lack of any coherence about why people were only allowed to meet in groups of 6 and no more, why certain establishments could reopen and some could not. I know it was a fast and it was fast-moving and unprecedented situation, but given the draconian nature of the regulations, we really needed to be better than we were at parliamentary scrutiny. And given the release of the WhatsApp messages from the former Health Secretary, that's certainly given me food for thought that perhaps all the decisions were not made on a scientific basis. So I have to say, if we do find ourselves in another pandemic where measures are being proposed that affect people's daily lives, then the ability of this place to openly scrutinise and question government on decisions before they are made as well as having access to the full scientific advice, will be vital. If decisions are taken transparently, and dare I say it, if everyone is seen to be following those rules, then we stand a much better chance of maintaining public confidence and that those measures are necessary. So I think that there's been a bit of talk about vaccine harms today, Mr. Sharma, and I don't want to be seen as unfairly critical of those who've raised those concerns. I do understand that sometimes there is a deep desire for a rational explanation about the sudden loss of a loved one. I also believe you should be able to ask legitimate questions about vaccines. It is perfectly reasonable to debate who should receive a vaccine and how often they should receive it. It is also legitimate to scrutinise government decisions, particularly ones that impinge on individual liberty. But there is a world of difference between doing that and descending into the dark world of conspiracy theories, which suggests that vaccines do more harm than good. That risks pushing people away from potentially life-saving interventions, and over the long term, it risks damaging the public's perception of the importance of a tool that has been used to eradicate diseases that have frequently ruined lives. As we've heard, from smallpox to TB to polio, vaccines have saved millions of lives over the years. We cannot now abandon the importance of this work because of a few videos on YouTube. We need to be able to challenge and question, of course, but we should not ignore what decades of experience has shown us about the value of vaccinations. So in conclusion, Mr. Sharma, this treaty has nothing to do with Bill Gates. This is not the first step in creating a world-dominating authoritarian state. I don't believe it will even impede on our sovereignty. What it will do, though, is enable the combined efforts of our brilliant researchers, medics and scientists to jointly tackle the increased threat that we face from pandemics. We achieve far more together as a species when we work together. I think the far bigger risk to our continued existence on this planet is not the so-called Great Reset, but a descent into paranoia and distrust, so that we avoid using our brightest and best, and they end up working in silos. They don't share their knowledge and efforts collectively. We want to avoid that. From pandemics to climate change to eradicating global poverty, we face many challenges as a species, some of which I believe are existential. But if we do not seek to work together to meet those challenges, then we will ultimately all be the worse off for it.